The 1796 light cavalry sabre is, as the name might suggest, a light cavalry sabre. That is, it was used by light cavalry, such as light dragoons or hussars. The 1796 light cavalry sabre features a relatively broad, for the period, curved sabre blade with a hatchet point. It has a wide, shallow fuller, and is relatively different to the 1788 pattern sabre that went before it and was used by light cavalry, and in fact which is the sword that is featured in John Gaspard Le Marchant's treatise of 1796. John Gaspard Le Marchant was a cavalry officer, and he was the designer of the 1796 light cavalry sabre. He's recorded as saying that for light cavalry, curved blades of the sort used by Turks, Mamluks and Hungarians were preferable. And in fact, these swords are in fact almost certainly the basis for the 1796 light cavalry sabre's blade. It's not, as some people have claimed, modelled on a tulwar. Indian tulwar blades have a very different cross-section and quite a different point shape, although they have superficially a similar degree of curve very often. This idea that the tulwar was a model for the 1796 light cavalry sabre seems to be more of a modern, or at least a later 19th century impression, and it seems to be wrong. In fact, where the confusion may have come from was that the 1796 light cavalry sabre was quite a popular sword in India with Indian cavalrymen, and the blade itself was sometimes dismounted from the original hilt and mounted into tulwar hilts and used on tulwar hilts. However, the 1796 light cavalry sabre blade is very distinctive from most tulwar blades and is usually easily recognisable when mounted in a local Indian hilt. The broad curved blade, thanks to its shallow fuller, is relatively light for its size. The blade is only about 32.5 to 33 inches long usually. And the curvature and the shape of the point, the hatchet point, does mean that it's not particularly good at thrusting. This was one of the criticisms aimed at the sword, and ultimately one of the criticisms that led to the eventual design and adoption of the 1821 pattern cavalry trooper's sword, which was a compromised design with a spear point that, whilst being curved, was much less curved and was a longer, narrower blade that was more suited to be able to both cut and thrust. Some later writers, who were big fans of the 1796 light cavalry sabre, preferred the sword because it was an excellent cutter, and the sword blade that came after it, the 1821 pattern, was a compromised design that they claimed was not so good at cutting, even though it could thrust better than the 1796 light cavalry sabre. Another criticism aimed at the 1796 light cavalry sabre was the fact that the guard wasn't very protective. The hilt of the 1796 is relatively simple and is undoubtedly modelled on earlier Austrian and Austro-Hungarian swords. The hilt of the 1796 light cavalry sabre features a simple knuckle bow in a very distinctive P shape. This shape was emulated on later German-Prussian sabres, and in fact carried still onto German swords into the 20th century. There's some debate around the shape of the guard and why it has this distinctive P bulge at the pommel end of the guard, and there's no direct real model for this type of guard. It doesn't seem to have come from one specific inspiration. As to why it's shaped like that, theories abound, but nobody really knows. It's possible that it makes the hand quicker to get into the hilt to draw the sword, but nobody really knows. The hilt features two langets, which descend from the guard on either side. These really serve the purpose of securing the sword once in the scabbard, and protecting potentially from rain, for example, going down into the scabbard and damaging the blade or rusting it. These langets are secured usually by a sort of dovetail joint and sometimes brazed into place as well. The hilt is secured onto the tang in two places. This gives a really strong construction, And in actual fact, on antique examples, the guards do sometimes get loose on these swords, but it's due to the leather washer which is inserted between the blade shoulder and the guard. That leather washer sometimes rots away, and that is what creates the movement of the guard. In actual fact, the grips and the back straps of the hilts themselves very, very rarely get loose because they're secured so well onto the tang with these two attachment points. And these two attachment points are the standard peened end of the tang, at the pommel end of the sword, and a lateral or sideways rivet which goes through the side of the grip and through two ears which are attached to the back strap of the grip itself. So there's really two attachment points through the tang of the sword. This gives a very secure and solid construction. And this manner of construction was carried through onto the later 1821 patterned sword. So it was recognised as a very secure method of attachment and was itself a relatively new invention and hadn't really been featured on swords in the 18th century by and large. It was a fairly new invention but was clearly liked for its solidity. The scabbard for the sword was made of iron, brazed, so it was folded round in a tube and brazed, and then an end piece brazed on, and it was wood lined, so the wood lining was there to stop the blade rattling around too much inside, protect a little bit from moisture, make the scabbard stronger itself, and to a certain degree help prevent the sword from being blunted too quickly by being contained inside an iron scabbard. Many people question why iron scabbards were used at this time, and very simply it was because they were very tough and durable and easy to make in a factory process. So wooden scabbards undoubtedly were better for maintaining edge sharpness, but wooden scabbards were famous for being easy to break, and governments and large militaries didn't like the idea of this. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the 1796 light cavalry sabre is an excellent cutter. It's a very handy sword, it feels light in the hand, and it usually weighs under £2 or around £2 in weight, and it usually has a point of balance relatively far from the hand, often as much as 8 inches away from the guard. This the combined light weight and the point of balance far from the hand means that it is undoubtedly and usually a very good cutting sword, and one of the reasons no doubt that it had such a fearsome reputation. Just a word on that reputation, there is a prevailing myth that goes around on the internet and in a few books stating that the French complained about the grievous wounds given by the 1796 light cavalry sabre during the Napoleonic Wars, and as far as we can tell this is simply not true. It seems to be a modern myth. There is no period evidence for any sort of complaint about the wounds caused by this sword, and if you just stop and think about that, it is a ridiculous proposition in the first place, given that people were being shot to pieces and stabbed and cut in all sorts of ways by all sorts of weapons. The fact that any enemy nation should complain about the swords of one of their enemies is kind of silly, even in the context of the period. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.